Hello, I'm Mercedes Stephenson, and this is the West Block, politics, perspectives, and players. China formally charged 2 Canadians last week after they were detained last December. The charges against Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are espionage and violating China's national security. Both Canadians were held within days of Huawei's chief financial officer's arrest in Vancouver. Since then, relations between the two countries have been on a collision course. What does all of this mean for the fate of those 2 Canadians who are behind bars, and what might they be experiencing? Kevin Garratt and his wife Julia lived in China for 30 years. Then suddenly in 2014, without warning, both were arrested. Julia was detained for 6 months, but Kevin was held in prison for 2 years. Joining me now to talk about that from Toronto is Kevin Garratt. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mercedes.
The Chinese government has arrested and charged the 2 Michaels, as we've been calling them in the media, after months in detention. What is your take on what that means for them? Is it a step forward because the Chinese are actually formalizing this, or does it put them in more jeopardy?
It's part of the process. They're not in more jeopardy. They're in a different location, still being detained, still can't do anything. But now they should be able to see a lawyer. But for me, I didn't see a lawyer until almost 1 year into our ordeal. So there still might be some time before they actually get access to a lawyer.
What is it like going through this process when you're arrested out of the blue, detained, you don't know what the future is, they now have at least been charged, but there's been so much uncertainty. Describe what your experience was like for us, Kevin.
Well, a lot of fear. I mean, when I made my way, or they took me to the prison, it was just, I was very fearful because I'd seen a lot of, bad movies about prison, and they weren't encouraging. And when I got to the prison, you don't know who you're dealing with, especially if they don't speak Chinese, which I don't think Michael Spavor does. He'll have a very difficult time. I spoke Chinese so I could get by better, but you still don't understand the whole system, what's going on there. There's still so many uncertainties, and that's really the biggest problem is you don't know what's going to happen, and you'll be waiting months and months and months and not knowing anything.
What kind of conditions are people held in? What kind of conditions did you experience when you were in Chinese jails? Because they're very different, obviously, than our system here in Canada, and I can't imagine how harsh those conditions must be.
Well, the first 6 months were residential surveillance, and they were in one room, 2 guards, 24/7 watching you, and the interrogation went on in that room, so I almost never left the room except for the washroom, even ate in the room. When I moved to the detention center, or what we would call a jail, it was 14 people in my cell. Those numbers changed quite often. I mean, people came and went probably over the 19 months I was in that prison cell. There would have been 80 or 90 people who passed through. You never leave the cell except for an embassy visit once a month. The washroom's in your cell. The food comes to the door. Not all the time. Food only comes about 2/3 of the time. And then you have to pay for it. Your shower is a glass enclosed little cubicle so the cameras can see you. There's absolutely no privacy, and you've got very little space to move around. You basically have your little wooden bed that you're on, a very thin cotton pad, and it's incredibly uncomfortable, and you don't really know what's going on with the other people around you. Some would be murderers, some would be petty thieves, there'd be drug addicts, there'd be policemen, there'd be all sorts of people that will pass through that cell, and some of them are just not nice.
When you think about the other aspect of this, which is the national security charge and the allegation that the 2 Michaels were stealing state secrets, you were accused of something similar.
Yes.
What's the interrogation process like when the Chinese lay those kinds of charges?
Well, the interrogation, they basically finished their interrogation now. If they've moved them to a detention center, most of the interrogation will have been done, and they would have been interrogated for us, it was up to 6 hours a day. It could have been day or night. It was 3 officers sitting across from you at a table, and I would be sitting in a chair. Very, very intimidating because they're not asking you questions nicely. They're very harsh at times. They never beat me, but they threatened a lot. They threatened to send me to North Korea. They threatened to execute me. They said I could get 7 or 8 years in prison. So they use a lot of intimidation tactics to try and make you confess something, even though there was nothing to confess.
Did you have the sense that they believed the charges against you, or that it was all about intimidation?
It was a lot about intimidation. After, I would say, 2 to 3 months, it seems like things changed, and it was almost like they were doing their job, but they realized I'm not a spy, or they certainly acted that way. And I tried to cooperate in every way with them, but they had an agenda, and there's no way I could change that agenda.
You had limited consular visits, and that has been the case as well for the two Michaels who are detained.
Yes.
How important are those visits, both in terms of potentially getting out and in terms of giving people hope?
They are incredibly, incredibly important. You know, for the first 6 months, we saw a consular official every 2 weeks, which was really incredible that we had that privilege. But then the last 19 months, it was once a month, like the two Michaels are having. And they have the ability to bring hope or to bring, you know, despair. Because what they say in those 30 minutes that they have will speak hope or not. So if they can bring messages from their family, that's incredibly good, incredibly important. But you know, one thing that one of the consular officials said to me each time she left was, "I hope I don't see you again." And that just spoke to me like, I hope so too, because that just instilled hope in me.
What do you think the Canadian government could do, if anything, to try to help the fates of these two detained Canadians? Should they be pushing harder? Should they pull back? As someone who's been through this, what do you wish the government had been able to do for you?
I hope they keep it in the forefront at every meeting with Chinese officials, at every opportunity, even internationally. They have to keep it in the forefront. I didn't know really what was going on for those 2 years. I was told, oh, the government's treating it very important. They're trying to raise it at the highest levels, but I never really knew what was going on. But I would hope in this case, with the two Michaels, they are keeping it in the forefront, keeping it in the news, and keeping it in front of every Chinese delegation, a Chinese official that they meet.
Would you like to see the Prime Minister call the head of China?
I'm not sure if that would be helpful, because it may be, but he'll only call unless if there's a solution, I think. And I think Xi Jinping would only answer if he has something important to say. Otherwise, he's going to stick to his guns, and because it's all to do with Meng Wanzhou anyways.
Kevin, what was the darkest period for you when you were being detained?
I can think of a number of different times. One time when they told me this was Christmas 2015, they said, well, it's being delayed for another 6 months, meaning they're going to keep me there for 6 more months. And I just felt really despair, because I just thought, how can I stay here another 6 months knowing nothing, not knowing how my family is, except once a month I would get a bit of news. That was really hard for me, and the only way I could get through something like that is in my faith and putting my hope in God. There is no other way to do it.
I know your faith and that hope was so important to you. What advice would you give if the two Michaels could hear you right now? What would you tell them?
I would ask them to pray and just trust that God will take care of them if they put their trust in Him. I mean, I had to choose, make that choice every day. There is no other way to do it except choose to trust God is going to work this out. And when you have that hope, it sustains you day to day.
Were there days when you struggled with that, even as a man of faith?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I struggled because nothing changed. Every day the situation was the same, the same food or lack thereof. You're stuck in that cell basically 24/7. They're supposed to let you out, a couple times a day into a caged area that's attached to the cell, but that didn't always happen, and we knew every weekend we would never get out because the guards for that section go off, and there's only a few guards on duty, so you're stuck in your cell that whole time. It's very, very difficult.
Are you still haunted by that experience? I mean, it seems so searing. When you come home and you're now back in Canada, how often does your mind go back to your time in that Chinese cell?
Most days I think about it. If I'm reminded of something, it doesn't leave you, because especially now with the two Michaels, I just, I can imagine, and I know exactly what they're going through. The fear, the unknown, they probably have been threatened, I would think, but not being able to communicate with their family, and the government probably can't communicate to them what's really going on, because for us, we could never talk about the case, and so I didn't really know about Su Bin, who was arrested in Vancouver just before we were taken, until I was released 2 years later. So I didn't know that was the reason.
You had no idea what had prompted your
No.
arrest?
No, I had no idea.
Wow. When you look forward, and people are considering going to China, would you advise them to stay away? Or as someone who lived there for many years, do you think that it's still worth that risk of going?
I don't think there's a problem going to China. It's a little riskier right now. If you're a tourist, I don't think there's any issue. As long as you're obeying the rules, you're not trying to take pictures of military things or look sneaky or use a VPN in China, then I don't think there's an issue. But if you've been there a long time, if you're doing business, there could be an issue.
When you look at the way that the essentially global community is interacting with China right now, I'm curious your thoughts, because you understand this society, you understand the culture, and you have the trade war between the U.S. and China, Canada caught in the middle. As somebody who has so much experience there, are you concerned about sort of the global temperature around this file?
I haven't really thought about that. I don't think I'm that concerned. I don't think either side, Canada, U.S., or China, will escalate things, except in these instances with, the people like myself and the Michaels. That's how they'll escalate it, but it won't go to a war, I don't think, at all.
Do you think that the Canadian government should be cautious when it arrests Chinese nationals? Because people are saying that this is because of the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, but the RCMP are saying, look, we honor American warrants, we have to do this. You have to carry out that law enforcement aspect without considering external factors. It seems like that's a tough balance.
It is a tough balance, but I think we need to stick to the rule of law. We have laws. If people break the laws, we have a good relationship with the U.S. I think we should honor that and continue to do that and not bend because there's another country that says we don't like that.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I'd be curious to ask you, having Huawei in Canada, is that a risk?
Well, I think the news has already covered that type of thing. That there probably is some risk. I'm not technical by any means, so I don't know what that would be. But the U.S. seems to think so, and they probably delved into it very well. So I would guess so.
Okay. Kevin, any message that you want to give to Canadians at this time when there are Canadians behind bars facing an uncertain fate in China?
I know how I was released was because people prayed, and I hope that people across Canada would pray for the two Michaels continually. I know literally there were thousands of people in churches around Canada and really around the world that prayed, that wrote letters to the government, that urged them to act, not angrily, but in, we call it quiet action. So I hope that people would take this to consideration and really, speak up and pray.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining us and for
You're
sharing
welcome.
your story. And of course, you have a book that I know is out there that people can get on Amazon that tells more than we had time to in these couple of minutes.
Yeah, it does. It's called Two Tears on the Window on Amazon, Kindle, Kobo. I hope people pick it up and see. You can read a lot more details in there about what they're going through, what they're feeling, and just everything that's going on with them right now.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. Please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm Mercedes Stephenson for the West Block.